Hello, welcome back to the studio. Well, as you can see, this week we're on a really small canvas. I think this is an 8 by 12. And really it's a bit of a continuation of what I did last week. You see, I did a painting which involved using a lot of greens, a lovely stormy sky. And I mixed lots of different sorts of green colours in that. And it provoked a few comments from one or two of you lovely subscribers and watchers about mixing colour. In particular, greens, which I think is something we see a lot in landscapes and a lot in seascapes as well, but predominantly landscapes. We're surrounded by tons and tons of green colours. So I thought, let's have a play. Now, as I said, this is really a continuation of what I did last week, where I mentioned about doing plans. And you know that I love to plan my paintings. I don't like going in sort of half-cocked. I don't want to sort of start my painting not really knowing where I'm going. And I mentioned that you could do sort of just a quick sketch and then you could expand it into a more detailed sketch. Well, this is an expansion of that idea where you not only do a sketch, but you actually maybe do just a test painting, a small colour version of a finished work. Now, it doesn't mean to say this is going to be scrapped. You might intend to finish this painting and make it the primary painting, but it's a nice way to do a painting that maybe is going to be a long project, to do something to work out your colours first, particularly if it's greens. So I thought, let's pick a lovely green reference photograph. So I picked that one. I thought that's particularly nice. I love the shafts of light and that really bright spot there. That really takes your eye, doesn't it? So I thought that's a nice reference photograph. It's on Pixabay. I'll drop a link for you. But of course the main things is it would really test our sort of mixing skills and our green mixing skills in particular. So let's get started with this. And those of you with eagle eyes will have spotted over there a range of green acrylics. That's right, I'm going to be doing an underpainting. Let's get on with it. Let's start by having a look at some of the acrylic green paints I've got. Well, I've got things from light green. I've got a lovely cadmium green here, which is really super bright, isn't it? That's really lovely and bright. But the colour I'm going to be using mainly is this colour here, which is hooker's green. And you see it sort of sits sort of somewhere amongst those. These two are really quite bright. This one's a light green, this one a cad green, and this is a dark green. Now, this is going to be the colour which I call my sort of mid colour. If it's hard to see because it's in the tube, but if you look at all the green colours on my reference photograph, and there are bright sharp ones and there are dark green ones, somewhere in the middle of all of those greens is this green, hooker's green. And I found over the years of painting that this sort of middle green or mid green colour gives me a great option because it means it's sort of a universal green colour. I could use it pretty much anywhere on my painting, but I can change it. I can make it brighter or darker. I can make it darker by adding a little bit of black acrylic or gesso to it, so I can go for a really dark green, or I can brighten it up by adding a little bit of white to it, so I make a bright green colour. And of course I can change its value by adding yellow to it, which makes it much more lime coloured. And you could darken this down by adding something like Payne's grey to it. And I've got some over there, I can't reach the tube, that's why I forgot to move it closer. But you could add Payne's grey to this, you could add some dark sienna to this, and that will actually reduce the brightness of the green colour. Now, I'm no expert on mixing green colours. There are so many ways of mixing green, well, it'll make your head spin. But what I do is I get used to using a range of green colours and I pretty much stick to them. That way, when I mix colours, I almost know beforehand what I'm getting into. The other thing I tend to do is not to start introducing lots and lots of different colours. I tend to make one colour, like hooker's green, the primary colour, and then I play with the values either side of its tube value. In other words, I don't suddenly think, right, hooker's green, I'll add light green to it for one dab of paint and then add a dark green colour from another tube of paint to it along the way. I just use one primary middle green, And that, I think, is an important way to start doing a reference painting. So let's get on and start this painting with some underpainting. And for that, of course, I'm going to need my plastic plate and a piece of sponge, my favourite. Now, this is a fairly small painting, and you might not feel you need to really sketch this out, but just in case you do, let's do that. Let's put some markers on here, and one of the primary ones obviously is this pathway through here in the foreground. It doesn't quite go to halfway, so a little bit less than halfway, and it starts quite small, and you know what, it goes a little bit straight for my taste, and I might just want to kind of bend it round a little bit. So let's take it from sort of small and get it to a little bit larger. So again, I'm sort of just adjusting the painting or the reference to suit my own particular taste, and that disappears off that disappears into nothing, and it's going to come around to there. So you see, I've gone from 0 to quite big in the foreground here to sort of gives the sort of right look of perspective, and of course that really bright looking tree just there on the side, incidentally enough, it's probably about a third up from the bottom, and not quite central. Obviously, it's a little off to one side. I've got a nice big old tree through here. It's actually just sitting a bit lower in the picture, so make sure you drop the foot of that tree a little lower. There we are. And I've got another nice tree here that sits a little bit lower still. So you've got 1, 2 and 3 levels here. 1, 2 and 3 levels. And that's going to be sitting down there. And those levels are kind of an important thing to remember when you're painting, because they're a bit like stepping stones, aren't they? Closest, middle, furthest, and then the far distance. And there's lots and lots and lots of trees back in there. But you see this kind of nice progression, sort of moving from one to another, the path taking your eye. So everything sort of leads you off into the distance. So there we go. We've got a very nice, very simple sketch here. And I'm going to start off by just putting in some of this background foliage. Let's have a quick look at that reference again. I'll bring it up here in the corner. And we have lots of sort of middle green tones back in there, but they're sort of not the darkest. The darkest greens are down here in the foreground. So we got a lot of middle green colours, sort of mid green, not bright greens, not limey greens, that's limey green, and dark greens here. So we've got a lot of middle colours here. And as I said, I'm going to use a piece of foam, and here's my plate. I put some of that original Hooker's green colour out. And there you go, there's a little bit of Hooker's green. And another thing you might find useful is to have a little piece of spare canvas, or in this case it's just paper, and I use this to test my colours. And I also make notes on here. If I use a particular mixture of colours, Hooker's green with a touch of black or touch of white or touch of yellow, I'll make a note on here, and then I have a ready reference. Now, very useful if you're going to upscale this painting into a bigger piece, that you can do this, and you've got this. It's a bit like sort of having a fingerprint for the painting. So there you go, that's Hooker's green, straight Hooker's green. And if I look at my reference picture, you can see that that pretty much fits in with what I'm trying to get from my background. You can see now why I like Hooker's green. It's a very nice middle green colour. And sometimes these colours are called middle greens or mother greens, or I can't remember, they've got lots of different arty sorts of phrases for these sorts of green colours, but they are a common thread running through a scene. And as you see, I'm just using hold that on a corner. I'm not using much paint here, I'm just taking a little bit, dabbing it out well, and this is just an old car sponge I'm using, nothing special. And I'm just going to stipple this on here. I want to get a little texture into here. And it's a little darker at the top. Let me move my camera around so you can see a little more easily what I'm doing. Okay, so as I said, it's just a cheap old car sponge. I cut it into blocks about 1 inch or so square, maybe a bit larger. and I doctor the surface with a pair of pliers. That's the cut surface, it's a bit smooth and flat. So I get the surface I'm painting with, and I sort of use a pair of pliers or a pair of nippers just to pull off, or you can even do it with your fingertips, just to give it a little bit of texturing, a bit like the surface of the moon when I finish this. If you go in with the same pattern over and over and over again, you end up with repetition. But if you dab and then turn a little bit, you end up sort of crisscrossing, and it gets you a much more sort of changed look to your dabs. Now I'm thinking here also about my reference picture. I have beams of light coming through the top here, and they make this look a little bit milky. So I can go a little stronger here with my green colour, so that I have a nice dark colour behind it all. The corners of my painting are much darker greens. Okay. Have I got enough of everything in there? I'm just looking into my background of my reference. There's not much greyness back there, so I'm going to put a bit more of this in. And say, keep looking back at your reference. Once you start a painting, it's not an excuse to ignore your reference. You continuously look back at your reference. I'm going to keep my path still there. I know roughly where that is. So once you start painting, there is a tendency I've noticed with artists particularly when they're sort of starting out, they take one glance at the reference picture and they never look at it again until the very end, and they go, oh, it doesn't look anything like the reference photograph. And the reason why? You didn't look at the reference photograph, did you? So my eyes are continuously going from here down to my reference photograph, which is just out of shot. My eyes flick backwards and forwards, and I'm looking for patterns and shapes. I see there's a lovely big group of bushes here, a darker corner up here, nice and dark over there, a little bit of background, not too much. There's nice fill in here as well. So most of my grey has disappeared now behind this lovely first layer of Hooker's green. I'll let this sit and dry for a few minutes. This is my canvas after about 10 minutes. It's just dried a bit. Now the next step really is to look at, now sort of got the mid-range of greens in, let's get the darkest darks on next. And for this I'm going to darken this green colour with a little touch of black. Now don't go mad with this, because you can throw a lot of black at this and it just goes too dark too quickly. Once again, compare it on your little side canvas here, the one you're using for testing. Put a little bit of it on. I've got some raw black on the corner of my sponge there. I should have dabbed that in a bit more thoroughly, but it's okay. And again, dab that on there, have a quick compare. You see, it's pretty good, isn't it? It's not bad. It looks pretty good down in that corner. It's pretty close. Little green colour there. Once again, keep that reference picture really close to hand. And now go gently at this, because you just want to start smothering this with everything. Now, I'm not going to cover the path, because that's actually a difference. That's not dark green, that's dark brown colours in there. So I'm not going to cover that. This is going to stay empty. But I'm going to just drop in some of these dark colours in here. There's another dark corner there, and this back edge here is also really dark. So put a little bit in there too. Right up to the corner, there's a tree through here. Just about make it out on my painting. Use acrylics for everything if you wish to. I'm just using this just to get the primary blocks of colour into my painting. The reason why I use acrylics, the most obvious one, is speed. This goes on, dries quickly, and I can paint another layer straight away, and then I can finish off with oils. And that's a very nice technique to use. But if you didn't have acrylic paint, you could do this in oil paint, but it would just take a lot longer to put on these green colours, then let them sit for a day or so, and then add another layer on top. If you went in wet on wet too soon with a piece of sponge, boy, you'd end up in a real pickle. But it's not impossible, it just takes a lot of time. And I need to put a bit more green paint out, and I'll carry on adding in some of the little darks, and I'll do some short time lapse through this section. So there you are, my mid-green colour and my dark shade of that mid-green colour. And as you see, from my little reference here, you start to see how I'm sort of mapping out these large clumps of dark green colour here. This very dark corner and edge mapped in there as well. A little bit darker up in the corner there, not too worried if it's not exactly right. And I added a little bit more darkness back into here. Didn't kill off all of my mid-green colours. And I left that as a little bit of a marker with some grey in it. And of course my pathway going to be through here, and that little feature tree which is going to be in here. So you see, just in the space of a few minutes I've managed to really block in some nice big chunks of colour for my painting. And this is the whole idea of using just one value of green and then changing it. The next value of green, of course, could be a lighter value. For that, I might choose to use yellow, or even add a little white. So, mid-green, dark green, light green. I'll leave this to sit and dry for a few minutes before I make the decision. And of course, I'll be testing it on my canvas first. Before I add any more foliage to my painting, I think it's important that we look at what's happening further back in the painting. There's a whole bunch of trees back there which need to be added first, and then we can carry on adding some more foliage over the top. As you can see, they're not very distinct. They're sort of a pale brown colour, almost bleached out. I think some of these sunlight rays across here are actually doing most of that sort of softening effect. But I do want to put something in the background there, even if I don't do all of the trees. Now, I could play around with all the various green colours I have and just use a filbert brush, a liner brush, but I've got some burnt sienna colour here, quite light brown. Put a little bit of yellow with it. You see I get quite a nice sort of soft brown tone. I think that will work quite well for my painting. I'll add a few drops of water to it just to make it a little bit more liquid. Incidentally, I keep a pot of water on my table when I'm using acrylics, to which I add a few drops of dish soaps. It just makes the paint sort of dissolve a little easier from the brush. Oops, let's have a quick look. What do we think? Oh, it looks a little bit orangey to me, but, well, I could always darken it adding a tiny drop of black. I think that's not far off. Even if it's got a bit of a greenish tint to it, I'm quite good with that. When you look at the reference picture, you see it does have a little bit of a greenish tone to it. And that I hold the brush well back means I can use just my fingertips rather than having used my whole arm. You see, by spending just maybe 10 or 15 minutes of just adding in a whole bunch of branches and trunks and background detail in your painting, how much more you can fill it out. Again, I'm going to go back to my piece of sponge, my original sap green colour. This time I'm going to add a tiny touch of cadmium yellow. And this is a really bright yellow colour. Again, still using that same green tone. I'm not using a different colour green because I want that to be my common colour. And again, I'm not going to cover everything in with this kind of bright green colour I'm going to mix here. I want this to be a little bit of a highlight, but I'm going to be highlighting this with oils because I want to use a slightly brighter, sharper colour. And I happen to know that acrylic paint dries a little bit more dull. And that's just from my own experience of working with acrylic paint, that it goes on looking quite bright and you get these little bursts of yellow here and there, and after about sort of 10 or 15 minutes of drying time they tend to fade Whereas oil paint goes on bright and it stays bright. And I put it right across the edge of my piece of foam, and think about how a branch sort of leans in, and just using the edge of my piece of foam. It's tricky to demonstrate this, but if you see, I'll try and do it on this side. Just using the edge, so you can sort of create these little fingers of colour. Let's demonstrate on here. That's to be honest, wouldn't it? There we go. So just using that on an edge, and you can kind of create these little fingers of colour for a branch. It looks like it's sort of leaning in from one side, sort of splaying its little fingers out. I think a little more of this, and then we are ready for some oils. Of course, one more thing to do is to actually paint in the path, or underpaint it. And for that, I just got a flat brush. We've got some browns and some blacks on here, and I'm simply going to block this in. Again, I'm not looking for the finished colour here, I'm just looking for a good dark underpainting. Remember that this lays flat, so you want to be sort of working a little bit of a zigzag pattern here, maybe a little more of a dip in the centre to indicate wear and tear, and let this sort of come out and pick up on the edges. It sort of tucks in. There we are. And make sure it's nice and broad at this end. And I will add a little more black in this foreground there. I want it to look like it's coming down into the shadows. And saying we'll add some highlights to this in oils. Nice and small little wiggle off into the distance. Now, I just want to sit back and let this dry. And once it has, then we can start getting some oil paints going. So that's my underpainting all completed. And as you saw, I used just one value of green for everything. I just added different colours to it to get all of the ranges of colours in my painting. And this is important that you don't sort of chop and change and put 3 different colour greens on there. Just one, a common green middle colour is perfect for this sort of scene. Now, in the next section, I'm going to be mixing up some colour charts, so making my own little mini colour wheels based upon the greens that I like to use. And it's an exercise I think you should be doing as well. So sit tight, a little bit of colour mixing in green next. Okay, let's make a colour wheel. This is almost dry, and I've done this for us. And basically, it's just sap green and a circle or two arranged in sort of a spiral shape roughly. And it's sap green that I use, a regular sort of colour, regular sap green in my favourite brand. And I've got just other brands and favourite colours arranged around it. So, and you can design this any which way you want. I did this, it took me a few minutes to do. But essentially sap green is my common colour. It's a colour I use a lot. In the acrylics I like hooker's green. That's my favourite sort of mid-tone colour. And I'm going to put out some black and white. And what I'm going to do is take a little bit of sap green and mix black into it. A little bit of sap green, mix white into it, and so on and so forth. And I've got some yellow ochre, some blue, alizarin crimson, Indian yellow. And what I'm going to do is make a whole colour wheel of all of my favourite colours that I would use on my palette. And there's nothing on here that I wouldn't normally put out for myself, so I haven't picked sort of abstract colours. I haven't picked sort of like violet, which is a colour I wouldn't use very often. So, very simple process, and I'm not going to make you sit and watch this all the way through, but quite simply I have got all those colours out on my palette, and I'm just going to mix them up here and then put a little sample on here. And then you'll see in a minute when this is all completed. So sit tight. But it didn't take too long to do, and look at the variety of colours I've managed to mix. The common colour being sap green. You can see when it goes with red or alizarin crimson, we start going brown. And when we go obviously to black, it starts to become a much more dark green, and to white, obviously, a light green. Cad yellow produces these lime green colours, and various varieties of yellow ochres and umbras, ultramarine blue produces a blue-green colour, which is really nice for seascapes. But having done this using colours which you would find on your palette, let's look at a reference photograph. If I bring that up into shot, let me move my camera just a little bit, get that over just a touch. You can start to see where some of these colours, like this lovely brown colour in this tree trunk, you could make it from sap green and red or some alizarin crimson to get almost a Van Dyke brown colour. You can also see some of these lovely bright limey green highlights. That could be sap green and cad. Similarly, you've got some slightly sort of more ochre sort of colours in here, slightly less intense. And obviously sap green, yellow ochre could be the way to go. Now also remember when you're doing this is that all of these colours can be lightened slightly by the addition of some white. So you can add a touch of white into yellow ochre and sap green and get a slightly brighter shade. Okay, and the same with all of these colours. You can add some black into this colour here and get a darker shade of this lovely lime colour. So from one single colour you can get many varieties of other colours. I probably even got enough colours to actually do my pathway as well. If I think about that colour there, I'm thinking sap green, touch of red, maybe even a touch of white or a little bit of cadmium yellow. You see, and very quickly your eyes become accustomed to looking at a colour wheel, then looking at a reference photograph. And I suggest you do this with your colours as well. Put out whatever primary colour you'd like to use and make sure it's a sort of middle tone colour, so not a really bright, vibrant one or a really dark one, but a middle tone colour, midish sort of green colour, and make a colour wheel up of all the colours that you would typically have on your palette. If you do this often enough, eventually the information will stick. A bit like remembering your phone number. Mind you, I have trouble doing that, but you know what I mean. If you do this often enough, eventually you'll look at your reference photographs and you'll look at the colours and you'll think to yourself, I've got a pretty good idea what I have to do to get that lovely lime green colour. Sap green, cad yellow, maybe a hint of titanium white, and it'll give me that really super bright colour. So, now we've got our colour wheel, let's get back to our reference picture. I'll put this to one side to dry. So here's my canvas back. As you see, the acrylic has dried completely and it's time to apply oil paint. Now, I don't want to lose my underpainting, so I like to give this a coat of something transparent. In this case, I'm going to use something called Bob Ross Liquid Clear. And this really just to protect the surface of my painting. It also means I can blend and mix colours directly on my painting. The Bob Ross method that he lovingly showed us so many times on television is what's called a wet on wet oil painting technique. Very similar to wet in wet with water. In other words, where you've flooded the canvas with a lot of water or your paper with a lot of water, then you drop colour into it and you let them mix. If you don't have a Bob Ross product like that, you can also use something like this. This is just refined linseed oil. The only difference is that it's a little bit more runny. You can see when you tip this one, it's liquidy, but it's a little bit thicker, and this is just a little bit more watery, so you need to be very much more careful with this than this one. This one you can get a little bit on there and get away with it, but this one you can put on just a fraction too much and end up in a real pickle. And to apply it, I've got a little bit in an airtight container, and I've got a very old brush. I'm simply going to scrub on a very, very thin coat. Now, small canvas, it won't need much, but you can see the immediate effect is that all my colours will suddenly burst into life. Anything that was a little bit on the dull side will suddenly brighten up. It's as though you put a magnifying glass over it. It's one of the nice things about using liquid clear or using an oil paint, a transparent oil colour, over an acrylic, is that it somehow sort of invigorates all the colours. Now just compare the greens on this side that look really bright and limey, and then sort of slightly more dull on that side. It's not much of a difference, but it can make a big difference when you've got a big painting that suddenly springs back into life after having looked, well, a bit sort of samey and a bit dull. I'll scrub that on here, and you've seen me do the test before. When I run my finger over it and I use a torch, my mobile phone has a torch in it, and you do that and you just don't want to see a trail, you just want to see a thinnest amount of liquid clear on there, no trail left behind, just a thin, even coat. There we are, all nicely coated up. And now let's compare our reference photograph to our painting so far. It looks a little different now. Let me tip my camera around a bit more. There we go. You see, it looks a little different now, doesn't it? With the liquid clear on it, it's changed. This has got a much more sort of subtle lime colour to it that this one doesn't have. But we can change this, and we're going to use oil paint to do it because it has a magical quality. Because it's quite transparent, we can glaze a picture. We can change the tone of the entire scene with a very thin coat of green. Let's get some going, and I'm going to put a little thin coat of sap green across my painting. Okay, so here's my palette. I had a bit of a tidy up, and I'm going to use that same liquid clear brush. I'm going to go into some of this lovely sap green colour, and you can see that you can pretty much see my palette through it. Now, not all colours are the same. In other words, ochre, you can't see much through that at all. It's opaque. You can't see the palette through white. It's opaque. Black is the same. It's opaque. And yet Indian yellow, you can see some of the colour through the palette. That's because some colours are transparent, some are opaque, and some are somewhere in between the two, semi-transparent. And it's the semi-transparent effect that I'm going to use next, because there's not much of the background sky showing, just a little bit up here and in a few little spots. But in the large amount of the space, it's got a nice greenish tone to it. So if I just work a little bit of that sap green into, let me just do just a section here, like there. Can you see how that looks different to the other side? Can you see that lime colour coming through? If I hold that up to it now, you can see that limey green colour. What's happened here is I've gone over the top of my hooker's green, being a semi or pretty transparent green colour, but very thinly applied, and using the liquid clear on top, I'm able to actually paint a transparent layer of colour. There we go. So I've saved a little bit here and a couple of bits over in there. And you decide how much green you want. I've used up most of my little blob of green. There wasn't much there to start with. But if you want to darken some of these colours, if you want to really add a little bit more green into that background, just press it into the canvas and give it a little rub, and you can darken an area. Now, how would our little colour wheel help us to decide what next to do? Let's fetch it over. I've moved my painting over to one side, and I'm going to bring up the reference picture up here in the corner. I haven't got three hands, that's the thing, because I also want to hold this as well. Now, looking at the reference photograph up there in the corner, I'm looking for darker versions of this lovely green colour down in here. So I want a really strong dark green colour, almost verging on black. And when I look around my colour wheel, the obvious one is sap green with a touch of black. I could go umber. That might give me a blue-green colour, which is not quite what I need for my painting. Sap green with a touch of black is probably the right thing to add to my painting. A darker version of that, so some sap green, a little tiny drop of black. There we go, just a little tiny drop. Give me that lovely dark green colour. Let's darken down these corners here a little bit more. And again, this is a subtle sort of transformation. As I do it, you'll notice the colour changes a little bit, but not a lot. If you look at that little bit of bright yellow there, I can make it almost disappear. Same again on this side. And I'm going to take some of this colour across my pathway, because although it's going to be dark brown, I can use a little bit of this dark green colour to get the process started. And I can darken down some of these little areas in here in my painting too. Work a little bit of dark green in here. See that? I made a patch of dark green colour there. And again, I'm looking at my reference picture, I'm looking at these lovely dark greens in here, and I'm thinking I need to just push my brush in there and just circle it around, make a lovely patch of dark green colour. There's another dark green colour just there, look at that. Really lovely, it's quite high up. Again, press with my brush, twirl it into the canvas, and push in some dark green. Once you get used to doing this, you start seeing all the other possibilities of glazing. And you can even come back and reglaze a painting which has been tried for weeks, months, or even years. You can come back and add a glaze colour, you can add a shadow green colour, you can make something look more lime and bright. The opportunities are almost endless. I think it's time we actually started putting in some of these bigger features next. Otherwise we could be here trying to fiddle with this glazing for a long time. For my big trees, I'd be tempted to use black, but really, are they black? Well, the more you look at them, the more you realise actually they're a very, very, very dark brown colour. So that one's got a little bit of what's called referred light, and that's actually light bouncing back from maybe somewhere else outside the edge of the photograph. So we actually don't want to be using just straight black. It's a bit of a flat dead colour. Let's have a look at our little colour chart. So we want a really rich dark brown colour. Again, using sap as the mid-tone or the mid-colour. So sap green and alizarin crimson. Or we could go sap green and red. I think alizarin crimson is my favourite. As you see, it produces a lovely rich warm brown colour. So let's mix up some sap green and alizarin crimson. Now then, let's have a look and see where things are going to be. Now, I want to paint in this little tree here, this little bright tree, but to the back of it there is some lovely dark foliage. Now, if I measure up, it's a little bit more than, it's a little bit on about the third, about here. And all I'm doing here is I'm just going to tap in some of this lovely dark chocolatey brown colour. This is just a shadowy colour I'm putting into here, and I could tint this more to the green side, which might not be a bad thing, and then a little bit lower than the tree we got this nice big tree trunk, and again just going to drop in a little suggestion of that. And it's not far away, is it? They're pretty much on the same sort of plane, just a little bit lower maybe. So I'm going to just drop that in there. Scratch it on. And then I mentioned that this tree over this side I think comes down quite low into the corner. So that one's over to there, and I think this one is lower still. Got a bit of a lean to it. I'm going to take it right through there. Right through that patch of lime green colour. And of course this colour won't react badly with what's on there because, well, there's already sap green there. So this colour will blend quite nicely with what's on my painting. I'm going to take it right through into here. I think there's a few little bits of dark green in here as well that I'm going to just punch in. And if I don't like the colour green I've got, which is somewhere between there, I could mix up some of the other ones. I can use a little bit of the yellow ochre colour, but that tends to be a little bit opaque. In other words, it stands out a bit too much. I think I'd rather carry on mixing up these colours, reds and greens. There we go. You see, I left little touches of highlight in here. The trick is not to kill all of this. This lovely little bits of detail in here, that you'd struggle to paint that now. if you come back and try and highlight that, you'll struggle to do it. So the trick is to paint and to actually not cover things up too much. I like that. That's that bright little bit of colour around in the back of that tree there. I'm going to leave that bit. See, when you're painting, you've got to be thinking a couple of steps ahead. There we go. So you can see I put in my nice big features. I think this tree could probably be a bit bigger maybe. But this is how I work up from just a little reference picture, a quick small colour version of it, to maybe use this as a reference for a bigger painting. Okay, let's leave that to sit for a minute and I'll think about the next colour. So the question you're probably thinking is, what do I paint next? You see, most paintings have a nice logical paint the thing furthest away, middle ground and then foreground, and it all adds up nicely. But of course in a situation like this, I want to add a highlight and I want to try and do something with some rays of light. But what do I do first? You see, sometimes when you're doing a painting, it's not always obvious. It's the reason why painting a little sample like this might be the key if you're going to turn it into a bigger painting. You might try something and think, well, no, if I did that again, I would do it in a different order. I have to try and get some nice rays of light to make this lovely bright background beams across my painting. But I also have to try and do a little highlight on a bush there and on the ground. And if I do the highlighting first and I hit it with one of my beams of light, could be in real trouble, couldn't I? But what I do have to do is let my painting sit, at least for 24 hours, because if I try and do anything on that with rays of light, well, it really will be a mess. So sometimes we just have to be patient. I'll go make some tea then. I've decided I'm going to do the beams of light first. I let my canvas sit for 24 hours and ooh, it's just tacky. I put these tree trunks on very, very thinly and I scrubbed them in really well. You can practically see the underpainting through this tree. Actually works out quite nicely. It looks like proper bark effect on here, but it's just tacky. If I'm careful, I might still get my rays of light on here first. And I think I'm going to try those first, then see if I can get the highlight in next. I think that's the order, but we shall see. You know, have a close look at those rays of light, because it's tempting to want to just use straightforward white, but in my experiences they look like laser beams, and I think these need to be tinted. They're either a blue-grey colour or even just a very, very pale green tone. So I'm going to start off with titanium white. I'm going to tint it and tone it right down and try and get it just at the start, so a few rays of light beams first, and then build them up and make them brighter. So I'm going to do them in stages. So here's my palette, and I've got a fairly sort of round, fairly softish sort of brush to start the process off. A little drop of titanium white, not very much. And I'm going to take a little bit of my blue. It's got a little tiny bit of green mixed in with it. That could be good, couldn't it? I've lost my paint there. There we go. I know what you're thinking, oh, that's much too blue. You might be surprised, actually. Well, I actually don't mind if it's on to the blue side of things. If it's a little on the blue side, I'm okay with that. And again, looking at the spread of light from the reference picture, it sort of goes from the corner of that tree, doesn't it, all the way to sort of over there. And there's sort of looks like 4 main sections to it. It cuts right across. So I'm sort of heading for sort of the corner of my tree to the corner of my pathway. Lay my brush very flat and just gently stroking on the canvas. As I say, it's better to do this with several light brush strokes than one heavy one. And I'm literally dry brushing this onto the canvas. Now, you may not be able to see that. If I add a little bit more, you'll see it starts to appear. Now, what I'm relying on here is I'm relying on the sort of the texture of the canvas and a few delicate sort of strokes with the brush and build this up. Now it kind of fits as sort of almost like a bit of a fan shape. One thing I do know about doing these sorts of light beam patterns is they want to be travelling straight. If they bend, it looks odd. Now, little trick I learned is if you don't have a marl stick, that's one of those hooks that you can use, you can actually use a long handled brush as a bit of a guide, and it's kind of useful, kind of keeps you on track a little bit. So you get a kind of a nice beam. Put that one there. I'm trying to hold it on my painting, which is a little tacky, but I mean sticky, not. See, there's another straightish sort of beam of light. I think these ones splay out a little more over towards there. These aren't quite so defined, a little softer. Okay, I think I'll move my camera around a bit. Shove my camera around to the side here, and what I was doing is I was using my brush and I was sort of aiming for the middle of my path there, and just using my brush as a bit of a guide. So I'm trying to put enough pressure on the handle of the brush and not touch the painting, so I've got a better grip on it now. And just touch and give it a little drag. I'm using the brush to guide my beams of light so they don't end up sort of being twisted or curly. And I'm just adding a few more. Actually very little paint on my brush, there's nearly nothing on there. I think I can probably do that a little bit, kind of freehand. So I've got the main 4 beams of light in here, and I'm going to add just a couple more. Now I've got those on there, a bit of a guide, I can sort of follow them. So I don't want to just leave these 4 beams of light. They look a little bit like laser beams. And I know that from experience, if I kind of pull a couple or 3 of them in together, it works really well. You see, and they kind of splay out a bit like a fan shape. So if I do that one a little bit more that way, there we go. And again, I'm using the smallest amount of paint possible. I quite like that. It looks quite realistic. If we look at our reference, you can see it's actually, the whole thing is quite a misty, murky effect. So we could actually get a little bit more random with some of this. It's not quite a beam of light, but it's more just general misty murkiness. So I'm just going to put a little bit of that over the top of these trees. Still quite wet is this tree. And I might pick up a little brown going through it, but again, I'm not too worried. Picking up a little bit. Let's put a little bit more paint on my brush. So there you see. It's taken me about 5-10 minutes to do this. Gently going at it with my colours. It's not identical to that, but I'm getting a nice effect all the same. You can see now that this is a little bit more to the lime green side, and mine's a little bit more on the blue side, so I can still play with this a little bit more. But I'm fairly pleased with that. I think I might stick with it. Yes, I think I'm going to leave this alone and think about putting on some highlights next. So after a couple of minutes of sitting back looking at it, I decided it was just a little too blue. So I went in with just a hair more green and white, and just to tint this down just a shade more. It's only a fraction, but it's just enough to change it from sort of an icy blue to a nice sort of soft greenish tone. It's a subtlety, and again, this is just an experiment. If I were to do this as a bigger scene, this is the sort of thing you do these paintings for, so that you can test things out, like using a little bit of green and white. See how far you can push things before you run into trouble. And I think that looks really quite nice now. A little hint of extra green. So, on to doing some highlights. Let's look at our reference picture again. The highlights are these very, very bright spots of information here on the pathway. That little line of bushes there, and of course, the real highlight just there. But there are other highlights. The back of that tree, Some little touches of colour here in the background. Don't ignore them because they sort of build the whole picture up. These are the little touches of colour which will bring your painting to life. Now, let's have a quick look at our little colour chart again and see if we can spot some colours which we think would work. Very obviously, I'm looking at colours like sap green and cad yellow. Sap green, touch of white, maybe even sap green, Indian yellow. Basically, all of the yellows with sap green make lovely highlights. Some of the colours that are less sort of bright and intense are colours like this. Sap green with yellow ochre. And you can look at the painting and see that there are actually tones of that as well. And before we start, let's have a look at my brushes. I have two brushes here which I really love for highlighting. The first is a raggedy old fan brush. Perfect, don't want anything too neat and tidy. And the other one is, well, it used to be a big fan brush, and one that I cut down. I made it into a bit of a dagger shape. You see I trimmed the edge of it off, and I've got just a few of these lovely broken little points at the end. These are my favourite brushes for adding those little speckles of light. It's not unusual to want to start with the brightest point first and then work away from it. And I suppose that's logical really, because if you brighten everything else up too much first, then when you come to put in the little superstar, well, he doesn't really show up. So I always think when I'm doing highlights is to maybe pick the brightest part first and then sort of work backwards from that rather than trying to work up to it. I find it works best for my own particular paintings. So cad yellow, super bright, a little tiny touch of sap green, not much, just a touch. And you can see that I want this paint to be a little bit thin and oily. I want it to stick easily to here. Now look at the shape of my brush. I really want to make sure that that's opened up. I really kind of get that, a little dab and kind of really press those little bristles, open them up. It's just a series of little speckles. Now have a look at our reference picture here. Just pick out where you think the brightest point's going to be. Put that little bit there right on the very top. And there are obviously the light's coming from the left. So I'll put in just a few of those little dabs there. Save a little shadow. And again, just work away from that. More green, I think, into that for the sort of back of it. You can be too bright with highlighting. Let's tone that down a bit. You can overdo it. It's very easy to do. You should know what I'm going to say. Do a little, stand back, because you can sit here and over highlight everything and then stand back when it's too late and then wish you'd not done quite as much. And I think I'm as guilty of doing that as anybody else. I think about doing some on the other side there, and again I might switch colours. I might go for more of the Indian yellow or even for a little touch of ochre. I'll do a little bit of time lapse through this and just add some more little touches of highlight. In that last section, you saw me adding all these little delicate highlights to my painting. And I hope you kind of understand the care I took when I looked at my reference picture, get that I was in some cases placing just little individual leaves, just tiny spots and speckles of highlight remember, highlighting is a gentle process. It is a case of adding, standing back, adding and standing back. And I know when we would watch Bob do this, he would literally get in there with his 1-inch brush and he would bash in some highlights. He was on a time crunch and he had to get the painting finished for the show. But when you're doing your own highlighting, take time. It's probably the most delicate stage of a painting when you can blow it completely by just overdoing it with the highlights, and then you've got the problem of unpicking it all. So I treat highlights with a tenderness and a care that I think you need if you're going to get the best from your painting. I might have added just a little too much. I might have just made this a hair too bright. It's not a problem though, because I could leave this to dry for a few weeks and I could mix up some sap green or even a touch of black and glaze this and knock back down the colour a little bit. So all is not lost. But take care when you're highlighting. It's a gentle process done a little piece at a time. Final bit, let's do the path. And for this I need a nice warm brown colour, and we know when we look at our colour chart that if I use a red colour, so like alizarin crimson and some sap green, maybe even a touch of white, I can get a nice warm colour. So let's go. A little touch of, actually I've got some dark sienna. It's dried out on my palette, but that's okay. So I can make dark sienna, or I could make red sap green and make myself dark sienna. So I could mix up dark sienna colour, whichever one I want. Add a little touch of white to that one. Remember, this is quite a bright little path. It really looks like it's catching. It's got a nice reddish tone. So that's dark sienna, and that's my version of dark sienna. So you can make it. You don't, if you run out of a colour, you can often make the colour you need if you know what you're mixing. I'm getting confident with my colours, you see. I've played with my colours enough times to know what I'm doing these days. But learning to be confident with your colours is kind of half the battle, really. And it's by using those little colour charts. Kind of don't go throwing it in the wrong place here. If you look at the angle of this little tree, it's towards the base of this little tree, kind of in here somewhere. Make a little mark. I'm quite good. I left a little piece unpainted there of grey. There's actually some grey canvas peeking through. I kind of left that there as a little bit of a marker to remind me. I think this colour needs to be a little bit more orangey. We know how to make orange. We take Indian yellow, a speck of red. That'll make a nice orange colour. And how do I know that? I made a colour chart. That's how I made it the first time round. I think that's going to be the colour I want. So you see, making those little colour charts is so important to getting your eyes tuned in. Now then, look at that. That's the colour I'm looking for, isn't it? And again, I'll stand back and have a look at this from the other side of the studio, decide if I like it or not. And whilst I've got a little bit of that going on my brush, try and pick a spot where that's a little bit on the bright side. Got some referred light at the back of this tree. I just knock some off my brush. Just drop in a little suggestion there. Little speckles. So what is the process teaching me about my painting? What am I learning from this? I'm probably learning that I should have done some highlights on these tree trunks, maybe in acrylic, so it didn't interfere with my rays of light too much. That's the first thing I'm thinking now, is that maybe I should have done this in slightly different order. So I'm learning to maybe change what I'm doing here a little bit. I'm also probably learning that I needed to paint this maybe over a couple of days. So not to try and get it all into a 3-day situation, because I've got to paint a nice video for you. So this is a painting I would allow maybe more a week or two to paint. So again, I'm learning all the time about my painting and what I would have to do to make this work. This is the most intense green colour I can produce. I can't really make it much more intense than that. There we go. I think there was one little touch of grass there. I'll stand back and see if this is the finished painting. So the camera's as far away from the painting as I can get at, and I think you see that it's got that nice intense look about it. If I put the reference photograph close in, you can see how much more intensely that colour is being picked up and how much darker all of this is. And on my painting, I said I think I've overdone it a bit with the highlighting in here. I think you can see now what I'm talking about is that this area probably is just a little too bright, and it might be distracting you from that little intense area. So I might come back and darken this down a little bit and see what difference it makes on my painting. So, after a little more tinkering, here's my finished painting. I think you'll agree, it's a little mini masterpiece in green. I hope you enjoyed watching this tutorial, because just making a simple colour wheel of your own favourite green colours can really help you master your next mini marvel. In fact, I quite like this little painting enough to keep it as the finished article. I don't need to paint the big one. I rather like what I've done. Now, if you've enjoyed watching me explain how I get around painting green colours, then you'll want to watch some of my other videos coming right along, because they explore a whole bunch of different things that might just get you into a pickle. Happy painting, everybody!